This is Carolyn Gilbert, and we are doing another one of our podcasts featuring a person who has become a legend or a near legend in the world of the art of the obituary. I am in Texas, and Dr. Corey Franklin is in Chicago. Our guest today is Krishna Andavolu, who is the managing editor of a very interesting new online magazine called obit-mag.com. And if you are a person who loves the obituary, you will be absolutely thrilled to know that this magazine does not only some wonderful writing and elaboration on the various obituaries of the week or of the month, but also with wonderful graphics and the work of several outstanding writers across the country. My first encounter with managing editor Krishna was at one of our obituary writers' conferences, and when I looked at him, I thought he must have gotten into the wrong group because he was very young, good looking and very sharp. And so when I found out he, in fact, was in the correct location, I was thrilled to find out that he had not only an interest in obituaries, but a great idea for a new point of access for obituaries. So, Krishna, welcome.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. It's a pleasure to be talking with you, even over the internet airwaves. Though it's more fun when we're in person, I must admit.
That's right.
But yeah, a legend, I think that might be overstating the case. If I were to use the words of the New York Knicks great Walt Clyde Frazier, I would call myself a precocious neophyte at best. That was an interesting experience for me. I was, I think, 24 at the time, setting foot inside I can't remember the name of the hotel in Las Vegas, New Mexico.
Plaza Hotel.
The Plaza Hotel. What a wonderful sight. And the reason I got into obituaries specifically, in some senses, wasn't of my own choosing. I had always been a student of history, and I'd worked previously on a magazine about documentary photography. As that was being published and continues to be published, I got in touch with two architects from Princeton, New Jersey, who had this idea a crazy idea for a magazine about obituaries. So I agreed to take on the project because what I thought I was getting myself into, and what I found, is that the obituary as a form has this wonderful capability to be shaped, to have a malleable existence, to talk about so many different things. Of course, the life of the person who's died. Of course, the circumstances of their achievements and how they got to where they were. But also about ourselves, about the way that we think about our history both individually and as a culture. And as we've been publishing, which we've been publishing now online for 4 years, we've found that not only rings true for people, but also for places, ideas, any number of different sort of avenues of thinking about our own history, and as a result, kind of our own future too. So it's a heady topic, let's say that.
Tell us a little bit more about how the magazine came to be.
Sure. The story, that sort of our creation myth, is that our founder, his name's Bob Hillier, he was on an airplane about 10 years ago and looked to his left to find a professional woman, probably in her 50s or 60s, reading the newspaper and being visibly moved to tears. Now, Bob's a pretty inquisitive fellow and quite personable, so he leaned over and he said, is there anything I can do? What is bothering you? And she replied that she had read the obituary for the actor Bob Keeshan, who portrayed Captain Kangaroo, amongst other sort of famous children's roles. And so reading that obituary sort of, I think, in a sense, kind of put her in this time capsule, a wormhole to her own youth. And as she was, cruising at 35,000 feet, she must have remembered what it was like to be a child, to sit in front of the television, or to have those kinds of thoughts that maybe as an adult you never have anymore. And so, the obituary as sort of a nostalgic element is important, but it's also the way that a personal narrative can be enwrapped with the narrative of the life of someone of great repute or achievement. And so that's kind of that's the sort of, again, creation myth of what we're doing. And what we found is that potential of the form expands the more resources you put into it. The more thinking you do, the more research you do about a person, or the research you do about an idea or history, the greater it cashes out as far as how we consider the present.
This past week, I have spoken to a class at our regional university, Midwestern State University, a class in the nursing program. They have been studying all semester about the end-of-life issues. But once they got in touch with the obituary and what it meant to genealogy and history and their own families and so forth, it was just really rewarding. Of course, it just all goes together in one's life.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, end-of-life issues is something we actually talk about quite often. Like there's the politics of death, and of course, during the healthcare debate and onwards, there's going to be talking about America's aging population, how as a society we sort of allocate funds in certain ways to address growing concerns about health and of end-of-life issues as a result. But, also there are issues at the end of life that people hardly ever consider while they're sort of living and breathing and cavorting around. And there's also issues that happen when you're grieving somebody who you've lost, or who is close to you, or who is, in the process of dying, that, don't often, really don't come up, especially if you haven't had any experience dealing with this. And so we have an advice columnist, Judy Bacharach is her name, and so she has an advice column called Ask Judy, that is for families of the terminally ill, for people who are terminally ill, or for people who have recently lost people. And so you'd be surprised. I mean, if you've read it, you'll see that there's like a infinite variety of problems, questions, and ideas that come out from those circumstances.
I can see right away how the tool, the technology, would lend itself to that kind of discussion, because it makes it become personal. For instance, there are classes in grieving, and as a mother who lost a teenage child, I just rejected. I just said, I'm not going to any classes and talking to people about my grief. But in this kind of a setting, there is that ability to ask and to exchange ideas without having to, do it in a very public way. So what a service. That's a great idea.
Right. Well, and that's true. You bring up a good point. All of the letters are anonymous. We don't reveal real names, obviously. And for good reason. Often it's about the closest people you have to you during these episodes, during people's deaths, or after someone's deaths, that you have the biggest problems with, because it's a staging area. These high stress times are a staging area for pretty much every problem or neuroses or issue or jealousy even that we've harbored throughout, and this is a near universal thing.
Death really becomes a social event. It's a process of socialization, once again, because, in most cases, families are required to get together where they have maybe not been together. And as you say, all kinds of jealousies and disagreements, all that surfaces again, which is all tangential to the event of the sick and dying person. There are all kinds of arguments that go on. It just, bleeds right on through to the obituary. For me, the obituary was very therapeutic, but I did not have to, argue with somebody.
Right. Someone might want to do something a little less conventional, perhaps talk about goofier things, I guess. This is like what we're seeing in a lot of sort of death notices. I wouldn't say a lot, but in an increasing number of death notices across the country, or people are experimenting with the form. There was one sort of famous example of this over the last few months of a man who wrote what was essentially a love letter to his now deceased wife that was the obituary. It told her life story, but in a way that was remarkably touching and inventive as far as using the obituary as a method of telling a story. Certainly not a standard way, but I think this kind of increasing choices, or people making the death ritual, whether it's the writing of the obituary or portraying the character of the person who's died, this is something we're seeing more and more, and I think it's going to be the signature of the boomer generation as slowly they approach death, to look at it and honor it and make it a special experience.
And, it's interesting. Now, you live in New York City.
Correct.
Well, you live in the best part of New York City, Brooklyn.
True
and
enough.
I live in Texas, and Corey's in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
In my area, which is a rather small farming area, the services of the funerals and so forth are very conservative still at this point. They're still very traditional, and obituaries are very traditional until they realize that one is really in charge of one's own obituary. And then if one has not done it himself, his family, of course, is. And the way that that life is represented to the public. So it's kind of an educational role, the therapeutic and the honoring of the individual.
I'm sure you do realize that death is something that, is unavoidable and, an intrinsic element of our humanity, but for the most part is something people would rather not think about. So just despite sort of any kind of progressivism or anything like that, people still want to move on, which is totally natural. I mean,
of course.
Stages of grief. I mean, death, when we look at death in the magazine, our basic position is that examining death is about life. It's about living life, and it's about understanding why it's a special thing to begin with.
When you're counseling people about the obituary, sometimes you say, go ahead and think about it in advance. Mm-hmm. And they think, oh my God, no, because then they think, it's liable to jinx you if you got your obituary done. But it's a helpful thing to think about that in advance. It helps you think back through your own life, of course. But it is something that people would probably rather not think about unless they have to. But then, of course, if they don't think of it, the obituary comes at the time of greatest stress and family, and often it's the obituary that suffers because of the grief of the family at that particular time.
Well, in that case, it's more likely that the funeral director will write it, or someone else who doesn't really know the person that well. I mean, I think the idea is that the more, and again, this is sort of contrary to what I was saying before, but the more conversation, the more people accept and talk about these things, the better the results are.
And I think your magazine is such a nice diversity of the printed word and your special articles. I really appreciate what you've got online, and I'm just wondering, is there a way that you can gauge the level of readership at this point? And when you said it'd been online 4 years, I nearly fainted because it seems like just a moment.
Yeah, well, our readership has been growing, since day one, and so we're in this kind of special position of seeing those numbers go up all the time, and now it's about 100,000 unique readers a month, which isn't New York Times numbers or anything like that, but it's enough that we know we have a very dedicated and interested following. So we try to service that following in different ways. For people who are more casual, I suppose, one way we found to get people interested in the topic, or get people to consider the space of thinking about their lives in the past and transition, I guess would be the word to describe it. Yeah. Is doing sort of death of articles, which we do a lot because they're things that are no longer that used to be.
Right.
Recently, we did a piece. A great writer out of Chicago, actually, Kevin Nance, did a piece about the death of the femme fatale. How that is a character that sort of a type of character you hardly see in film anymore, in favor of sort of bubbly, ditzy kind of characters. And then on the other end of the spectrum, every Friday, this brilliant writer, Michael Schaefer, his day job is the editor of the Washington City paper, which is DC's alternate alt weekly. He writes a column for us called The Grim Reader. So what he does is he basically just sort of inside baseball about the art of writing an obituary. So he will consider every major newspaper in the country and in Canada and in England, and sometimes other parts of the English-speaking world. Look at the trends about how people covered a single death in various different ways, and what that says about what different cultures prioritize or find, interesting, or even just sort of the tricks of the trade, like how do you talk about this? What is important about that? And so it's a sort of a wide variety of readers and figuring out how to offer something that's of interest that's on this topic.
Well, I have one final thing I want to mention to you. We have looked at how the obituary is treated in major disasters, and of course the 9/11 disaster, the 3,000 or so people who lost their lives, and they could not be done in the typical New York Times obituary, standard format. So they did those wonderful little vignettes, and they were compiled into a book, and they served as kind of an intermediate obituary. My thoughts have been turning to Japan, how they are handling the recognition of those who have lost their lives in this recent earthquake tsunami.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So fascinating, I think, with Japan specifically, is that it is a culture that has a very specific relationship with death. We've sort of described the United States as having kind of a wide spectrum of how people deal with it or talk about it or act towards it. But in Japan, it's quite, for the most part, and again I'm generalizing greatly, a more uniform understanding and practice towards it. So yeah, it would be fascinating to see how papers cover it.
We'll keep that conversation going, and I want to thank you so much today for your time, and to let you know that we will be following obitmag.com.
Yeah.
And those of our listeners who may not have happened upon it should absolutely take a look at this wonderful magazine online. You have made a significant difference. You have certainly made a wonderful contribution with this magazine, and together we are beginning to cover the waterfront as far as accessibility to the information and to good writing. I thank you and will always welcome your input and ideas for how we can be of service.
Well, thank you. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. And I think just on a closing note, one of, the emerging issues as far as obituaries and death notices are concerned, and this is something we're keeping an eye on quite readily, is archiving.
Yes.
How are these... obviously, as a genealogical tool, it is the obituary is an indispensable object, piece of writing, document. And in, now these days with cloud servers, with larger data space, with news increasingly moving online, where do these death notices go? These are questions that we have. So yeah, we'll keep talking, and I hope it's hot in Texas.
Oh, it's just wonderful in Texas today, and we have the royal wedding.
Oh yes. Actually, we've received quite a bit of a traffic spike because of the stories that we've done in the past about Princess Diana.
Yes.
And I think what you're pointing to is that there's always this discussion about what is lost and what persists when someone dies.
Yes.
And the legacy of someone, specifically, Lady Diana, is always something that people come back to. And
yes.
So we have yet another, maybe a very high-profile example of that process.
Well, thank you once again, Krishna. It's been great to talk with you, and I hope to see you soon, perhaps in Brooklyn.
That would be lovely. And be well, Carolyn. Thank you.
Thank you so much.